Hello and welcome back. Today let's have a look at the active and passive voice in English. As usual, you'll need a pen and paper to write down some important notes. Let's start with the voice. The voice is the term used to describe whether a verb is active or passive. In a passive sentence, the verb is said to be in the passive voice. Similarly, the verb in an active sentence is said to be in the active voice. The voice of a verb tells us whether the subject of a verb is acted upon or is acting. So, there are two types of voice, active voice and passive voice. Note, sentences written in the active voice are easier to understand than sentences written in the passive voice. The active voice is when the subject of the sentence is performing the action. For example, the man wore a grey hat. The man is the subject. The active verb is wore and the object is a hat. The dog jumped onto the boy. The subject is the dog, the verb is jumped, and the object is the boy. Christy will give a book report to the class. The subject is Christy, the verb is give, and the object is a book report to the class. The passive voice is when the object of the sentence is having the action done to it, then the verb is passive. The grey hat was worn by the man. The subject is the hat. The passive verb is worn, and the object is the man. The boy was jumped on by the dog. The subject is the boy, the verb is jumped, and the object is the dog. A book report will be given by Christy to the class. The subject is a book report, the verb given, and the object is Christy. The passive voice is a grammatical construction which is used to show interest in the person or object that experiences an action rather than the person or object that performs the action. In other words, the most important thing or person becomes the subject of the sentence. Reasons to use the active voice. Now, let's think, how do you decide when to use the active voice and when to use the passive voice? Well, both are grammatically correct. However, the emphasis of the subject and the object changes. Usually, active sentences are shorter, more engaging, and perhaps less confusing. Most writers prefer to use the active voice because it's more direct. Let's compare them here. Active, the waiter dropped the tray of food. Passive, the tray of food was dropped by the waiter. The active voice is less awkward and clearly states the relationship between the subject and the action. Compare these. Passive, your request for funding has been denied by the review committee. Active, the review committee denied your request for funding. The active voice sentence pattern propels the reader forward through your writing, avoiding weak prose. When to use the passive voice? In general, the passive voice is less direct, less forceful, and less concise than the active voice. Normally, passive sentences allow the subject to avoid responsibility for the action with a neutral and an objective tone. Use the passive voice in the following situations. Use the passive voice when you don't know or you do not want to reveal the performer of an action. And use the passive voice when you want to emphasize the receiver of an action. For example, awkward passive. My bicycle was repainted by John. Deliberate passive. My bicycle was repainted. The performer is not mentioned and the emphasis is on the bicycle. Form of passive voice verbs. The passive voice requires a double verb and will always consist of a form of the verb to be and the past participle, usually in the en, ed or t form of another verb. For example, active voice, John baked the bread. Passive voice, the bread was baked by John. Was is a form of the verb to be. Writers should be familiar with the forms of to be, often called linking verbs, so that they can easily identify the passive voice in their work. Here is a quick review of forms of to be. Am, is, are, was, were, be, being, and been. Note the forms of to be in the examples of the verb to kick using various forms of the passive voice. Is kicked, was kicked, is being kicked, has been kicked, was being kicked, had been kicked, is going to be kicked, will be kicked, can be kicked, and should be kicked. Often passive voice sentences will contain a by phrase indicating who or what performed the action. Passive sentences can be easily transformed into active sentences when the object or the preposition by is moved to the subject position in the sentence. Here are some examples. Passive, the cookies were eaten by the children. Active, the children ate the cookies. Passive, the tunnels are dug by the moles. Active, the moles dug the tunnels. Please have a look at this table. You can pause the video and write things down. Then let's move on to our next lesson.